So hello, good afternoon. My name is Casey Keene. I'm the Director of Programs and Prevention for the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I also lead the Adult Children Exposed to Domestic Violence, or HDV Leadership Forum. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the second webinar in our Speakers Initiative webinar series. This one is on navigating challenges in storytelling with audiences. Now, before I introduce today's panelists, who are members of the HDV Steering Committee, I'd like to share a bit about the work that we are engaged in together. I'd like to start by sharing the NRCDV's We Stand statement, which really grounds and guides all that we do. We stand with individuals and groups who have been targeted, degraded, threatened, or marginalized because they are Native Americans, people of color, immigrants, Muslims, women, LGBT, or people with disabilities. We stand against white supremacy, racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and all other forms of structural oppression. We stand with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, especially those most vulnerable and with limited access to services and protection. We stand together in celebration of the rich diversity of people in this country and the vitality and strength they bring to our communities and society. We stand with those who embrace self-care and community connection as necessary and powerful for social change. And we stand with other activists and organizations who continue to work passionately for gender, racial, economic, and social justice for all. That said, the HDV Leadership Forum is a project of the NRCDV that embraces these values. We were established to amplify the voices and experiences of adult children exposed to domestic violence to enhance our movement's work. These are faces of some of the faces of our 12 current steering committee members, all who are advocates and change makers in the movement to end gender-based violence, who identify as having experienced domestic violence in childhood. We represent diverse backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives. Each of our stories is unique, and each is multifaceted. The HDV Speakers Initiative was developed to help build the capacity of adult survivors of children's exposure to share their stories publicly. The initiative includes the creation of a Speakers Bureau and the development of capacity building tools, including this guide that you see here, which we published last December and is available at vonat.org. And you can see that Brecken shared the link to that guide in the text chat. Thanks, Brecken. This year's webinar series explores key topics and questions that were raised by members of our and by participants in our very first Speakers Initiative webinar last year. If you were not able to join us in November for Webinar 1, you can access the recording and related materials also at vonat.org, and Brecken will share that link as well. And we hope you'll also join us for our next webinar in January. This series is really meant to be responsive to your needs, so please continue to give us feedback and let us know what would be most helpful to you. In fact, we're hoping to have plenty of time to address your questions directly today. So for today's discussion, we'll engage with four of my favorite people. They're all HDV members who each bring a unique experience and a unique perspective based on their personal experiences as storytellers. So I'd like to start by welcoming Rebecca Balog. Hi, Rebecca. You may be muted. So
Hello,
Rebecca,
yes, I'm muted.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks,
Hey,
Casey.
Rebecca. So Rebecca has a deep-rooted self-identity as an advocate. Rebecca brings 15 years of healthy relationships and anti-violence work through national and grassroots activism. As a member of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center team, Rebecca serves as Grants Compliance Manager, tracking and overseeing program grants, deliverables, and reporting outcomes for various NIWRC projects. Rebecca invests in the restoration of sovereignty for Native women, safety for all families, and networking with allies who challenge both visible and invisible privilege. Rebecca is also a technical assistance specialist for the Women of Color Network, Inc. Next, I'd like to welcome James. James, can I call you Jimmy today?
Yep, you can call me Jimmy.
Okay, so James Henderson is a technical assistance provider for the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women through the Battered Women's Justice Project. Jim's background includes work in criminal justice as a probation officer for domestic violence offenders and clinical services as the director of a substance abuse program for drug-using young people and their families. Jim has designed and conducted training on the effective interviewing of domestic violence offenders and victims. He's on the National Advisory Board or acts as a consultancy team member for the Family Justice Center Alliance, the Battered Women's Justice Program, and the Center for Court Innovation. Next, I'd like to welcome Ruby. Hi, Ruby.
Hi, Casey. Hi, everyone.
Hey. So Ruby White Starr is the co-founder and president of Latinos United for Peace and Equity, the national arm of Caminar Latino. During her 25-year career in the violence against women's field, Ruby has operated and led domestic violence shelter and transitional housing programs, provided consultation and training in almost every U.S. city and territory across Canada and South America, secured over $15 million in funds, and leads the implementation of more than 50 federal projects to respond to violence against women. She is a trainer for Major League Baseball and the author of several articles, including Resiliency in Children Exposed to Family Violence in Practical Ideas for Overcoming Risks and Building Strength in Youth, Families, and Communities, and most recently, Moving from the Mainstream to the Margins, Lessons in Culture and Power, which was published in September 2018 in the Journal of Family Violence. It's an excellent read if you haven't had a chance to see that. And it's also available for free. So if you're looking for a copy, please reach out to us at the NRCDV. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Olga. Hi, Olga.
Hi, Casey. How are you?
Good. So Olga Trujillo is the Director of Education and Social Change at Latinos United for Peace and Equity, a national initiative of Caminar Latino. She is an attorney, speaker, author, and survivor. Her experience over the past 27 years has been as a private attorney, an attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, and a consultant to many local, state, and national organizations. Olga is an internationally sought speaker and author, and is featured in the video A Survivor's Story, a documentary and training video based on her personal experience of violence. Her memoir for New Harbinger Publications, entitled The Sum of My Parts, was released in October 2011. So that's all of our panelists. So excited to be able to hear from them today. Before we do, I want to hear. So I wonder, Justine, if you could share our poll. And for those of you who have joined us before, this may look familiar, but I think really helps us get to know where you are in your storytelling journey. So if you could vote and respond to this question, which asks, where are you when it comes to sharing your story? Are you thinking about it? Are you writing it down and piecing it together? Have you shared it in trusted relationships? Have you told it in certain public settings? Do you consider yourself experienced in sharing with various audiences? Or could you be facilitating this webinar? Okay. I'll give you just another minute to chime in. And Justine, is it possible to share the results of this poll? It looks like they are broadcasted, so hopefully you'll be able to see them. Yes? Okay. So it looks like you're kind of all across the spectrum, but many of you have shared your story in a trusted relationship, and others are experienced in sharing it with various audiences. And some of you are just in that thinking about it on stage, which is wonderful. This is a perfect time for us to have this conversation. For those of you who do have experience in sharing with various I really would encourage you to chime in, when we're walking through these questions with our panelists, with your own experiences and challenges. Okay, if you could take us back to the PowerPoint. Thank you, Justine. All right. So a couple things I would like to say about assessing risk and readiness. Just that telling one's story publicly is truly an act of courage. It can be liberating, it can be transformative, but it's important to be thoughtful about the potential risks and harms, both to yourself and to those you care about, when deciding whether or not to tell your story publicly, in what settings, and with what audiences. Let me pull the slide up here. What we want to do, so there's many considerations when it comes to assessing your readiness, and today we're exploring some of these with a main focus on how to navigate these challenges that audiences may bring. We want to talk through some of what I'll call audience-generated risks, as a nod to author and movement mother Jill Davies. So you can be informed in your decision and thoughtful in your approach. So I'm calling them audience-generated risks. Now remember, you have the right to tell or not to tell your story, or even to change your mind at any time. This is something that is entirely up to you and what you feel comfortable with. Something's going on with the slides. Okay. So who is your audience? So it's really important to know your audience. I know this is something we say, but maybe not something we consider all the time. But consider Facebook. When I post something there, I'm reaching a personal audience that I would define as friends. But when I post something, do I think about every person that might be seeing every post that I share? No, I'm thinking about the same 10 people who tend to like my posts. And I sometimes forget that those posts also are going to be seen by my children's teachers, by former colleagues, by high school classmates, by neighbors, and a variety of people. So in that same way, when you are sharing information publicly, it's really important to know who you're speaking to, because it will help you consider some of the various perspectives that they may bring to the space, and how your message may be interpreted or misinterpreted. In many cases, you'll address a general mixed audience. However, opportunities often arise to speak with audiences that are really specific audiences of professionals, for example. In our guide, we really encourage you to consider key messaging for different audiences that might resonate best. So you can check out the guide for information on that. But additionally, and really where this webinar comes in, is that you may find that some audiences are more receptive or friendly than others. So let's first talk about setting boundaries. Setting boundaries is absolutely critical, both in advance and during your presentation, including decisions about whether or not you'll take questions from the audience and what to do when there's a question that you'd rather not respond to. So my first question for panelists is this. What has worked for you when it comes to setting boundaries in your storytelling? And that's open to whoever would like to chime in first.
Okay, so Casey, I'll start us off.
Okay, great.
So when I think about setting boundaries, I think about it in two ways. I think about it with the people that are inviting me to present, so the people organizing whatever the event is, and then the audience. So sometimes people get super excited when they invite you to come present, and they forget to do stuff like ask you if it's okay if they film you, ask you if it's okay if there's a journalist in the room that's going to take pictures, ask you if it's okay if when they take pictures they can put it on social media, stuff like that. So you can let folks know ahead of time about some of those things. Like, let me know. I usually try to just let folks know if you're gonna publicize this. Let me know ahead of time before you have a news crew or a journalist or folks taking pictures. Always check with me before you post stuff on social media. So I usually preempt stuff ahead of time. Sometimes too, people get really sometimes people get really excited because they think, oh, let's, she's coming in to do this. Let's have her, do this as well, come and meet with our staff or come, and again, like setting boundaries around that's really important too, making sure it's really clear what you're going to be doing, when you're going to be doing it, and making sure that you see that you've got some breaks. Either, that you have a little bit of prep time before you present, and make sure you have breaks after and in between presentations. I know that sounds really easy, but and that it should just be the way it is, but it isn't. Doesn't always work out that way. Yeah. And when I'm thinking about audiences, I try to set boundaries right up front. Like I let them know if I'm going to answer questions. I try really hard. This is going to sound very controlling, but I try really hard not having the audience have microphones because it's easier for me to walk around, hear what the question is, and then repeat the question. That way I can reframe it if there's victim blaming without embarrassing the person who just asked the question. And it's also easier for me to kind of manage someone who just got triggered and is about to just tell everyone the details of their own abuse. And so, but I let people know if I'm going to answer questions, I let them know how I want the questions asked. And this again is going to sound really silly, but I tell people in the audience to please raise their hand and wait to be called on. And then I joke about it because it's really obvious, but people will just start calling out questions, and then it's hard to hear, and then other people have been waiting for a little while. So I just try to make it really orderly. And then the last thing I do is I tell people that I will give them an answer. And it might be the answer to their question, or it might not be. And that's the way that I take care of myself.
Olga, you've got some brilliant tips in there and strategies. I think it's about, remembering that you can set those boundaries and people will do their best to respect them. And I feel like the boundaries you set, there's such a kindness to the way that you do it. So I really appreciate that. So what do others think?
Yeah, I would add a couple of things without repeating anything because I so agree with so many of the things that Olga said. I think one of the things, and this was many, many years ago, but it was one of the things I remember was going from local and state kind of presenting to national presenting. And there were things I didn't think about in terms of boundaries because it sometimes felt a little more respectful, maybe because locally or statewide, it's like a DV person bringing you in or something. They kind of think about some of these things. But what I remember when I transitioned is one of the things that happened originally in going to the national stage back in 99 and 2000 is that they had certain formats of how they used survivors sometimes, and they would bring you in as kind of telling your story, but then somebody else was going, some professionals were going to respond, or you were on a panel, right? And then you were going to share your story, and then people were going to comment on it, or there was just particular ways that I didn't think about at the time that I didn't realize going into them that they might not be as respectful as I would have wanted, particularly when you told a story. And then when a professional came on, they kind of rewrote the narrative to fit their own biases. I remember specifically a story that I told about a teacher that had done this remarkable, he had made me feel so good in a comment that he wrote on my paper. And my point was that intervention doesn't have to look like this giant formal, calling CPS or going to a support group, or sometimes it's those human things that you do that can help. And when the professional came on, they took it and said that was the perfect, opportunity for the teacher to do an intervention, a more formal one, which was the opposite of the point that I was making. And so I learned very quickly in setting my boundaries when people called me to talk that I was not going to put myself in a situation where I was going to tell my story and then somebody else was going to get to interpret it. So that panel, that didn't work for me. The other thing that I remember became really important is a lot of times they try to fit you in somewhere. And this is back earlier in my career too. And they would like do the survivor story and they would put you in during lunch or something, and these stories never sit well with lunch, I always say. So the thing I learned really early was to set that I had a right to set I want to call it my clarity in, how much time I was going to need. Sometimes I would get called in and told, will you come in for 10 minutes? And I'm like, no, because I'm much more than just telling you, this stuff real quick. It felt a little tokenizing, right? So my setting boundaries involved being clear about, I need at least this much time because I want to be able to tell my story and share my experience professionally as well. And I didn't, I didn't want somebody else remarking or to be part of a panel, and just all these things that I realized I had the ability to say, that these are the things that would be, that this is, I guess, my boundaries, where I'm willing to do this, and here's how you can help me do this in a way that's respectful to me.
Right. And in that way, too, you're also, claiming or reclaiming the value of your story and your value as a speaker in that space. That's great. Awesome tips. Thank you, Ruby. So, Rebecca, I see you chiming in the chat. Oh, Jimmy, go ahead.
The only thing I'm going to say is, for me, the boundaries oftentimes are my own boundaries. Like, I realize when I'm telling my story, since I'm talking about the violence that happened in our home and my experience being taken away and put into foster care and the requirements from the system, my story is directly connected to my mom's story and my sibling's story, but I make it clear that I'm not here to talk about their stories, right? And what I do talk about my mom is stuff that I absolutely have permission from her, but I am very limited on what I talk about her. I give some really small little details, but I make it clear to the audience that I'm not going to tell her story or take her voice or my sister's story. And so I tell them kind of how my experience was and what happened and what the interaction was. As far as people asking questions, I don't have a lot of people ask questions because I ask so many questions. So what I do is I talk about situations or experiences, and then I put the audience in my shoes, and I'm constantly asking them, how did I feel? So I give them examples. Okay, first day I went to school, nursery school, what did people want to know? What did I feel? And the audience kind of answers that all the time. So I'm constantly keeping the energy moving through the room and keeping them answering my questions. So I really don't have a lot of questions from people during my presentation.
Okay,
people will come up
awesome.
to me. They'll come up to me afterwards and ask me personal questions about my mom. But they don't. No one's really ever asked me that during their presentation.
Yeah, and I love that you set it up, in advance by saying, this is what I will address, this is what I will not address, and setting expectations there, I think, is really important. Thanks, Jimmy. How about you, Rebecca? Anything to add to the boundaries conversation?
Yes, thank you. Such great points throughout so far. And I think a good close for this question would be the foundation of it all is honor yourself and love yourself. We're sometimes invited where we know the audience we're walking into. Sometimes we don't. You have to adjust to the environment that you're placed in. Love yourself. If you're feeling that it's not the safest or the audience where you can go the whole story, follow your instincts. It's okay, I think, if someone does ask a question and you're uncomfortable answering it, honesty is the best policy. Whatever you need to say, let's connect on that later, or I need more time to think about that. Maybe give yourself that ouch, and have that in your pocket like a talisman or an amulet or the paperclip. If it's like me, I don't like public speaking. I work at it. So those little crutches and having that ouch. But yes, love yourself. This is your story. You can go as far or as short as you're comfortable with.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. I also want to lift up, I see Debbie sharing in the public chat, so I wanted to lift up her comments that she learned to make her boundaries very clear with the media. And when she does public speaking and the newspaper's there to do a story, she's clear that she doesn't want them bashing her father because she knows his side of the family will read the paper or also see the article online, and she still respects their feelings in that situation. So that's helpful because these things can be very tricky to navigate when you're putting your story out there and as your story impacts others, right? So thank you for sharing that, Debbie, and I encourage others to chime in as well. Well, thanks, panelists. I don't know if there's anything else that came up that you wanted to share before we move to the next topic.
You know, if I can say, I loved what Olga said about not giving people a microphone. If somebody was speaking for my organization, BWJP is really, really attentive to the ADA laws on rules and regulations. So a presenter would need to make sure that they talk to the conference planner and the people presenting to really be able to say and articulate why they didn't want the microphones with the people, what the purpose was. Everything she said was amazing and absolutely right on. But I know our office, if someone didn't tell them that ahead of time, that we would be nervous and thinking we're not complying with certain rules and protocol and procedures. That so having that discussion beforehand will work. The other thing, when you were talking about the media, I think it might be a good thing to ask to read things that are going to be put in print. I have never seen the media get things right. I was videoed by 3 people at a conference that I did in Wyoming, and each one said I worked for a totally different agency. One had me working for the Department of Justice. One had me doing as like a victim advocate at a shelter. They totally, and I gave them all the same information. So things can get twisted without us recognizing or being aware of it. It ended up not being a big deal for me, but it could have been, you know, had they said something different or twisted something else.
Thanks, Jimmy. So, yeah, awesome tips when it comes to setting boundaries. I think everyone can understand how critical that is in being protective of yourself. And also, you know, I loved to hear what Olga expressed around the kindness you can demonstrate to those in your audience who may say something victim-blaming that may be unintended and gives you an opportunity to kind of reframe and answer the question you want to answer, maybe instead of the question you're being asked. So let's move to the next topic, which is when your truth is challenged. So it really feels inevitable that at some point you will face victim-blaming statements or questions if you haven't already had this experience. Even worse is when audience members challenge your truth altogether. The fact is that many do not understand or honor the impact of trauma on our childhood memories. Or others may question whether things actually happen the way you tell them. So especially when it comes to those of us who have experienced childhood trauma and kind of walked that path of piecing together those memories that are often broken and not linear, and then putting them into a story format, we've faced those experiences of being challenged around the way that we recall events or what feels true to us. So my question for panelists is, how have you handled situations where your truth was challenged? So who would like to begin?
I guess I can start this one.
Okay, thanks.
And I would say, so I've had it happen in a couple of ways. So one is most of the time people, and I don't have data on this, so it could be, but most of the time they don't challenge you like in person. They just kind of maybe, at least not in a forum where you're doing a big speaking environment, right? Like they don't like directly get on and say, oh, that's not what happened, or oh, that's not true. That doesn't tend to happen. I find that one of the places to prepare for that, though, where that comes out a lot to me is in the feedback after and in your evaluations and stuff. And I always tell people, be prepared, because as supportive as, even when it feels supportive, when you get the evals back, there's always somebody that says something, you know. And it doesn't matter if you have 500 people that say positive things. There's that one person that says, you know, oh, this person was being a victim, or whatever. There, you know, and that's the one you hold on to. So I would say be prepared for those kinds of comments, because like when you expect it, it feels like more normal. But I think when I'm challenged, to me, there's one of the big ones that happened was when I was talking about, and this was on a one-on-one situation after a presentation where somebody is saying, I had talked about sexual abuse and my mother didn't know. And that person was arguing with me that my mother knew. They were saying, no, your mother knew. Like, there's data and there's research and there's, you know, all of this. And so they're throwing all this that there's no way my mother didn't know. And I didn't get into a necessarily argument. And I said, you know, I understand. But in my own way, I say I'm much more articulate when I say it now. But I think it reminds me of, there's a I think it's a TED Talk, but she's an author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who did the book Americana. And she talks about the danger of the single story. And hers is more about stereotypes, but it's the danger of listening to only one story is not that it's untrue, it's that it's incomplete. That's not the exact quote, but that's the theme of what's going on. And so that's basically how I handled it at that time, without those amazing words, is that anyone who hears, who takes an information and then generalizes it on everyone is then not going to be able to actually assist people, because everyone has a different story and a different experience. And so that what they're doing by taking in information, and then it's basically they're stereotyping then, right? And we all know the danger of stereotypes. And so in my own way, I think if and when my truth is challenged, I, in different ways, articulate the danger of a single story and the danger of people holding on to only their experience. As we've seen on the HDV, you know, there's people who, when we have conversations about, and it's not just here, in all kinds of projects that I've been on, when somebody says, it's very important to me that we don't act like batters can't change, and others that, well, it's very important to me that we don't act like they can. And it's very important, and no matter what project you're on, there's different lived experiences. You know, on child welfare projects, where want to make sure that that child welfare isn't forcing people to work together. And then others of us are trying to make sure that they're not forcing people to separate. They have to have multiple interventions. And so all of it is important. And so that's to me, one of the most important things that needs to come out is that there is no single story. And if you're approaching things in that way, it's going to be dangerous to someone.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Rebecca.
I wonder if I can jump in at this point, because there's something that happens because Ruby and I, you know, both share about our experiences, and we're both Latinas. What will happen sometimes is when I'm presenting, people will make assumptions about Latino culture as being violent, for example. And that'll be the evidence that they give, is that, well, look, you know, here we are at this conference, and the two people that are talking about experiences are both Latina. So there's lots of problems with that. But the main thing is, what I tend to do is I try to reframe things for them. I'm like, no, it doesn't mean that Latino culture is violent. It means it does, though, reflect on the value of storytelling and the skill of storytelling that Latinos have. And what you have is two people from this culture who are really good storytellers and can take their experience and lay it out for you in a way that will help you learn from it. But the other thing, what I find with disbelievers or, you know, people who challenge kind of what you're trying to bring, I tend to respond to them in one of two ways. And it kind of depends on how tired I am that day and how much I've been doing and how they're presenting their like disbelief. So in one, I either use humor or I'll challenge them with additional questions. So I remember this in two spots. One was a judge when I was doing a training for judges in Arizona. One of the judges started asking me a bunch of questions in what felt like a kind of cross-examining sort of way. And I could tell that he was trying to get to a point, but I didn't know what the point was, and so I wasn't going to go there with him. So instead I stopped him and joked and said, "Hey, why does it feel like you're cross-examining me?" And he said, "Oh, because I used to be a prosecutor." And I'm like, "Great. You know what? We're not in your courtroom. We're in my arena. And here is where I get to control, and you get to sit back." And I said, "So tell me, I can totally tell you have a point. What's your point?" And he wanted to make the point that my brothers were victims too, because I talk about how my brothers were forced to sexually abuse me, and I talk about how they were victims too. And I'm like, "Oh, okay, got it. Good point. Let's move on." And then another situation that I was in was with mental health clinicians. I talked about having dissociative identity disorder, and I presented with clinicians on dissociative identity disorder. And I've had clinicians in the room say to me, "I don't believe in dissociative identity disorder." And it's really hard not to react. Like, it's really hard not to react. So in my worst moments, I would say, "That's really great that you can do that. I can't afford to do that. Like, I don't have that privilege." And then two, sometimes I'll say, "Well, it's not a religion, so I'm not sure it matters whether you believe in it or not." You know what I mean? So I tend to, I think it's that I have like a sarcastic kind of humorous approach to things. So even if I'm just annoyed, it'll come across that I'm trying to be funny. And I think it's a little easier to deal with. Yeah. So the last thing is that's really rare for people to say in front of me and in front of other people. And it'll usually be that I can see it in their body language, so I want to hear what they're thinking so I can try to address it. But it's more likely to happen in the evaluation. And what I've done in the past is there was this one, the hardest one for me was when I was doing a training for law enforcement, and I was doing it for the End Violence Against Women International, Joanne Archambault's group, and it's around sexual assault investigations. And so I had a detective write in the evaluation that I don't believe her. I don't think it's possible to experience that kind of violence and not remember it. And so I went back to Joanne Archambault and said, "Hey, so I got this comment in the evaluation and it's really bothering me, and I don't know how to address it in the future. Like, what if somebody says this to me, or what if, like, how do I deal with that?" And she said that if you use the word repressed, for example, people think of the repressed memory, the backlash on the repressed memory stuff. So she said, don't use words that flag those kinds of things for people. Use the word recall. Use the word blocked out. Like, describe it with other words so that those aren't the things that pop into people's minds. And that was really, really valuable information, because I don't think I ever got another comment like that from investigators that are looking at sexual assault cases. Yeah. So anyway, so going back to the people who organized it might also give you some information in terms of how you might talk about it in the future that might make it easier for people to hear.
Right. Thank you, and thanks for sharing such intense examples with us. I think about, I'm thinking too, kind of about the emotional impact of being challenged. And I know later on we're going to be talking about wellness and self-care, so I think it will be important to revisit that. Because I know right now we're talking about how you handle it in the moment, but then there's also how do you handle the feeling, that it raises.
Yeah.
Thanks. So how about Rebecca? Did you have any insight into situations where your truth was challenged?
Yeah, going back to, all of our communities are so different. But in a lot of ways, tight communities, whether it's a reservation or just a tight community, a faith community where there's a church environment, it was mentioned earlier where family or bystanders, friends of family or other people in the community may challenge. And I find that especially when you're on a podium or a microphone and you're speaking to a large group and that may come at you, just going back to honoring yourself, this is your story, go as far as you want, but also just remind the room that you're making I statements. And going back to what Jimmy had recommended, that he will not speak for other family members, although he may mention to be descriptive and give examples. We're just telling stories through I statements. So I think that's just another tool or, an amulet or token in your pocket to keep with you as a safety net. And then one last thing, and this is my mentor. I probably say this on every call I'm on because it's just so wonderful. There will be hurt people. There will be other survivors in different areas and level of their healing. But hurt people. And sometimes that's what you might be feeling, people in a different area of healing. So if things get rugged, understand that that's usually where it's coming from.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Help us get through it. You're welcome.
Jimmy, any thoughts on when your truth was challenged?
I don't know that my story has been challenged. I did want to say my heart goes out to my distinguished panelist. As a white male, I never have to think that my story is representation of my culture. You know what I mean? And it's never a consequence to me. It's never questioned. And so I just felt a sadness when Olga was talking, to have to bear that extra burden when you're up there talking and be thinking about how, what am I representing? How am I being interpreted? I've never had to face that. And I'm sorry that you ladies have.
Thanks, Jimmy. Olga, did you want to respond or?
No, I was just going to say thanks, Jimmy. I want to give you a hug, but you're not here, so I'll send it to you.
All right. Well, thanks. This is all extremely powerful to hear from all of you. So let's move to our next topic, which is managing less receptive, or what you might call unfriendly audiences. So here's the thing we know. Trauma is stigmatized, right? So even if you're in a healthy place where you've incorporated your trauma experiences or perhaps draw strength from them, others may see it as weakness or brokenness, and their shaming and judgment may come through in the questions they asked, and the tone of voice, and the posture, however. So one helpful strategy is to always identify your allies in a space and make a plan with them for managing situations like these. So I'm just wondering, what ways have you managed less receptive audiences? Can you share an experience with perhaps an unfriendly audience that really informed how you prepare or how you present your story? So where should I start? Rebecca.
So this reminds me of probably not the exact same scenario, but it's pretty close. So unintentional unfriendly audiences happens quite often. And just recently, there was a presenter that was speaking on things and unintentionally, severely triggered some people in the room. And that allyship is essential because quite a few of us stood up and supported that person. I think being brave where in any way that makes sense to you. Sometimes you can be rugged. Sometimes you can go the kindness route, that's hurt people, heal people. But just bring yourself forward as far as you'd like to go, and also know that it's okay to shut it down and go down a different track of the story. Start bringing in statistics or tell a different story that's been used in another campaign and take the attention off of yourself. I think that safety net is a good idea to have. But I cannot stress enough, Casey, that allyship. Not only receive, but definitely be one. Because it helps.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. How about you, Ruby? Any thoughts on, tips for managing unfriendly audiences?
Maybe I'll say, I know on the last one I said, though I always look for the one smiling face. There's always one or two people smiling and nodding the whole time. And I watch them a lot because even if that's not how the whole audience feels, it feels like that's what they're feeling if you just focus on those two or three people. So that's like my go-to. But I'll say on a more, a little bit more difficult. I mean, I was at a meeting recently where it wasn't like we were up speaking in front of people, but it was still, to some degree, I don't want to call it an unfriendly audience, but there was people that had a particular perspective. And I think one question that I remember, there was a Native woman there who, because there's a conversation about child welfare happening, and she did say that she's having difficulty, trying to figure out how much she wants to participate and how much to engage and be part of the project and all this, because she's worried about how it might feel like, in what way she might be betraying some of her people. And then there was a white woman who, and it was more like the tone that was like, what do you mean? What do you mean you would be betraying? And I mean, obviously you have to not have a lot of knowledge or about child welfare to even ask the question. If you don't understand how it may have betrayed Native people. So it was kind of an ignorant question anyway. But I think, and I felt like it put her on the spot, and she did answer. But I think it's being able to, I think, be prepared and really know the issue that you're talking about in terms of being able to answer specific questions, right? It's like people will push back, but if you can, the more specific you can be, the more you can help them understand. For example, in that particular case, I was able to reframe it for her and say, well, if we don't understand the ways that the child welfare takes, even messages of resilience, for example. I know this is an example I use a lot to say, you take older children helping younger children and you pathologize it, and you turn it into a risk assessment. You turn it into something that demonstrates risk, where in many families of color, we see that as a way to promote family unity and bonding. Like, there's ways that you take things that are resilient about our culture and you turn them into pathology. And there's ways that, and that's an example, but like, you just have to have a lot of those, I hate the word, the war words that we use, but in your arsenal that you pull out, because unfortunately what those unfriendly or less receptive audiences need is you have to go a little bit one step further to I call it the so what, right? The more you can tell them, here's specifically some of the things that you do, and here's how you can do it differently, right? Like, they need that extra step of not just here's my story, but and a lot of the times I find that the unfriendliness and the receptive, that has to do with the inability to look beyond their own worldview. I experience that a lot. And so be prepared to give them another perspective so they can open up their worldview. And I know it's not our responsibility, but you don't have to do that, but I just say, for me, in my particular case, it has helped me, to manage for myself those situations when they occur.
And this is Rebecca. Exactly. That's why I had mentioned it's all educational moment. And it sounds like we've had the same experiences or seen the same thing most of the time. unless there's a heckler. It's just an education, and it's a teachable moment, and using that to go down a different road, a different track to expand their learning. Because most of the time, it's not ignorance as in rudeness, but uneducated perception.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. You said it much better than I did.
That's, one of the things I love about this particular panel is that each of us has experience speaking to different kinds of audiences. And so I love, Ruby, that you named specifically, child welfare workers. I know, Olga, you mentioned judges specifically. I know you speak a lot to legal communities. And Jimmy, I know that you speak with, probation and parole. You have kind of a different audience that you typically would speak to. So I'm really curious about, from your perspective, what an unfriendly audience might look like, or what you've learned about, responding to the audiences that you typically present to.
Well, so this is I'm not sure if this is gonna fit in, but I'm gonna try this. Part of it, I almost want to hear from the unfriendly audience. So how I even did my story in the beginning, I was training with the American Prosecutors Research Institute, and they were doing a segment on children exposed and determining if kids should testify or not testify. And the things the prosecutor said were just horrific. And it's kind of like, how like a racist or sexist person knows they're not supposed to say something, so before they say it, they look around the room to make sure no one's, and then they go ahead and say their racist or sexist statement. It was kind of the same way, because the prosecutors thought there was nobody who was a victim of domestic violence or was a child exposed that they could talk freely. So, and I wasn't really supposed to be in charge of that segment. I was just one of the staff there who literally was traumatized the first 2 or 3 times I sat through this training and listened to 70 prosecutors talk about these families. So finally I said, can I talk? And that was the first time I told my story, and we chose to do it at the end, because if I did it at the beginning of the segment, everybody would change their true feelings and what they're thinking, because they would have been constantly looking at me, right? I can't say this in front of this guy. And I didn't want that. I wanted people to say things and so that we could kind of unpack that differently and address that. So in a way, it's almost backwards. Like I know I'm walking into that, but that seemed workable. The other thing I was thinking about less receptive, unfriendly audiences. I do a certain amount of criticism of a lot of people in the system. Like when I tell my story, I criticize some things the police did. I criticize things that child protection did wrong. I criticize the psychiatrist, the social worker, a variety of people. But when I come through the story, I end up going back and identifying, I don't think any of those people were bad people. I believe the police officers were good men, did not intentionally mean to lie to me, did not even think about what the end result was. Because the first time I went to foster care, the police came in, talked to me, said I did nothing wrong, my mom did nothing wrong, I'd get to go home. Ended up saying a compliment of like, oh, you're a good kid. Normally kids from homes like yours, right? So kind of a backhanded compliment. And then when the social worker came in, again, she said, I did nothing wrong. My mom did nothing wrong. Ben Andy was the bad guy. We would get to go home. And then hours later, we're getting thrown in the foster care. And so what I learned that night is that police lie, social workers lie, the medical staff are in cahoots with them, and the system is absolutely not to be trusted. And so when I'm talking about what people did and how and I'm trying to say, that these are well-meaning people with well-meaning intentions, but their words and actions did devastating things to the families they said they were trying to help. And so I kind of let people know, I guess, to try to reduce some of the anxiety so people don't feel like I'm attacking their profession or I'm attacking them, that I'm just trying to give them a different lens to allow them to experience it from a child's view. And so that's kind of, I guess, how I try to deal with that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate that. Olga, did you have anything to add around unfriendly audiences?
Yeah. So a couple things. One is I find that anybody who has to attend my training, I'm going to have unfriendly people there, like mandatory CPS training or mandatory law enforcement or mandatory judges. And I do end up talking a lot to judges, law enforcement, and prosecutors. And I think it's because I'm an attorney. And even though I talk about psychological things, I don't know, they think that I get them somehow. Maybe because I understand the law and how the law works. So those are always challenging. In fact, I remember the first time I talked to a group of people that were required to sit in on my training, and it was child welfare workers. And they sat like with their hands crossed. They sat back in their seats with their hands crossed. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is going to be so painful. And it was like they were saying to me, I dare you to engage me. Like, I'm not going to make this easy for you. And I think the fact that that I use humor helps a lot with that. But I have had people say things that I find really hard to deal with. Like they make, and it's really interesting, Jimmy, to hear you say what you just said about the first time that you talked about your experience, because people will make these statements and not recognize that there are survivors in the room. So they'll say, oh, anyone that grew up in a home with domestic violence are broken, or anyone who has been sexually assaulted as a child is broken. Like they, and I see it when people talk about the ACE study. I see it like they'll say, well, if you grew up in a home with domestic violence, you're either going to be a victim or you're going to be a victimizer. And I hate that because it's not true. And they're saying basically to all people in the room, like, don't ever say that you are one of these things, that you're a person that grew up in a home with violence, because this is how we think about you. Mm-hmm. So I push back pretty hard on stuff like that. And I don't say it as eloquently as Ruby said it in terms of, the danger of one story, because that's basically what they're saying. Like, they saw a situation where someone was victimized after they grew up in a home with domestic violence, or they saw a situation where they were dealing with someone who was perpetrating domestic violence and they had grown up in that kind of home. And then they just carry that across. And what we're so much, people who grew up in those homes and that violence, we're so much more than that. Like, we just happen to also have experienced that, but it doesn't mean that we're still being victimized. It doesn't mean that we hurt anyone. And so I push back, and then I have to really watch myself. And of course, I have superpowers, so I can do this where I'm presenting, and at the same time I'm listening to make sure that I'm not saying anything that sounds defensive, because then it comes across like I'm defensive and reacting. But then showing all the power of people, that have grown up in homes that were really tough, but have done amazing things, in their lives. So that tends to be so when I think about advice for people who are thinking about doing presentations, is to think really long and hard when they're being asked to do a training or a presentation of some sort, and the audience is mandated to attend. When people self-select to attend your training, they're interested and open to the information that you're giving. So if you haven't done this for a really long time, stay away from those mandatory ones, because it's really, it can be triggering for the presenter. It can be disheartening and leave you kind of in a really bad place after presenting.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you're raising that around kind of how, like, the audience's body language and how much that can impact you as you're telling your story. Debbie, who's participating on the webinar, just shared, and I hope I can lift this up because I think it's a great story. She says she's done presentations with over 350 people and has been perfectly okay, but she did a presentation for a group of 20 men and was the most intimidated she had ever felt while sharing her story. She said, they were not very receptive to my story, or so I thought, because they didn't show any emotion at all. But after she was done, they all asked to hug her. So she said she was sweating through the whole thing. And I think that that's a really common experience for all of us who tell our story, where your perception of how people are hearing you may be completely off. Sometimes if there's a dead silence over the room, you may feel concerned. But really what it is people are just, in tune with you and, and listening and just like rooting for you. And so it's a hard thing to, because I feel like you have to do some self-talk there when it comes to kind of analyzing the body language in the room. And sometimes, Olga, when you're describing the men sitting with their arms crossed, like, yeah, what are you going to tell me? I mean, it's obvious. But sometimes you really don't know, what feelings you're bringing up with people, especially people who are socialized to not show emotion, right?
That's it, too, because what I was going to say is, like, law enforcement, they are skilled at listening to all kinds of stuff and not showing it. And mental health clinicians are also really skilled at that, and judges. So you're gonna be presenting to people who you can't tell how they're responding to it. It's really hard. But so I focus on the fact that they're staying in the room because they can go. It's a really good point.
Thanks. So please, in the chat, continue to send questions. I see that some questions are starting to come in, and we will be addressing those. Right now, I'd like to move on to, I think it's our second to last kind of topic we're exploring, which is when your story triggers others. This came to us directly from somebody who participated in a previous webinar with us. And here's the thing. We know that most of America's children experience trauma. Like, it's a common human experience. So it's really likely that much of your audience has also experienced childhood trauma. And it means that hearing your story will be triggering for some. And a very common experience are personal disclosures, either during your story or, asking questions or sharing experiences during your presentation, or people who come up afterwards to tell you their stories. I do want to remind everybody, though, that while that's real and triggering is real, what's also real is something that we call vicarious resilience. And that is bearing witness to others' stories of healing and resilience as having a profound positive impact on their own healing journey. And so, there's a flip side to the coin. You're taking people through this journey where, yes, you may be sharing information that is bringing up memories for them or difficult feelings, but at the same time, you also may be taking people on a path to resilience. And so anyway, this is all to say, what recommendations do you have based on your experiences in speaking to other trauma survivors that may be helpful to those who have wondered, what do I do when my story is triggering to others? So whoever wants to chime in.
This is Rebecca. I want to go back to that beginning of presentation housekeeping. Like, hello, this is my name, this is what we're going to be talking about. In our youth project, we're ever so concerned when we're talking about teen dating violence and violence in the home, working with youth and getting them engaged. We do lots of fun activities, but there's always a disclosure, usually after getting pulled aside. So as a part of our intro, in the planning, find out if there's a safe room. If it's a big conference, there's often safe rooms. Reference that is available if something is said and is triggering. Offer that, that someone can pop over after the presentation's done, and then also give that full disclaimer that even during the Q&A session, we could be triggering each other in the audience. So I think just a part of that planning and housekeeping. If someone is triggered in the space, it's not always an option, but our Native Love Youth Project, our team is a family team. And when we see something going on, we're responsive. So if someone is triggered in the audience, or, for example, a youth seems to be uncomfortable or struggling, we help each other out. While the presenter's talking, that youth or an individual would be attended to. So I think having a backup is also really works well for us, and it's a good planning item. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Others?
Yeah. So, Casey, so I wanted to jump in. So this is something I think about a lot, and then just last week had to really kind of think about this. So I present quite a bit on my experience of growing up in a home with domestic violence, and then also about sexual abuse that happened. And then I try to connect the reactions, the responses, the trauma pieces of the sexual abuse, and how that then put me at risk as a young adult, an adolescent and a young adult. So there's certain things that I try to lay out as I talk in my experience, and I've tried to soften it as much as I can. But there's a certain amount I need to talk about to show how the violence then plays out in the future, in a how compliance comes about, how you go from fight to freeze, stuff like that. So, and I always would do this disclaimer kind of when I set up the presentations that I do. I'd let people know, all right, so here's, I'm going to talk about my presentation before I do my presentation so you know what to expect. And one of the things that I would say is that I'm not going to use any graphic descriptions of violence. Well, I realized last week that what I think is a graphic description of violence is different from what other people think. So what I ended up doing, I presented on Wednesday to group, and then I closed the event on that Friday. And between Wednesday and Friday, I realized that during my presentation on Wednesday, I triggered quite a few people. And so I started my presentation on Friday with an apology for triggering people, recognizing that my presentation is hard, but that I had people come to me and talk to me about what it was that was triggering. And it's not the fact that I'm giving more details than they expect. It's that I set it up to say, this isn't going to be really hard to listen to. Like, I'm going to do it this way. And they trust that I'm going to do it that way, but then I don't do it that way, even though in my mind I think I am. So so what I would do is I would talk about how things happen. So what I'm learning now is really to not use terms, and this is something I try not to do in my training, but to describe what I'm going to do. So what I did then on Friday is said, so I'm going to, when I present now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some stuff that happened. I'm not going to use details of sexual violence, but I am going to talk to you about things that are really hard. I'm going to mention things about rape and about gang rape, and it's going to, it's hard because this experience is hard. So please take care of yourself while you listen. If you need to leave the room, leave the room. And so because I was so cognizant of it, I even paused right before I was going to give some descriptions of, something that I thought might be triggering to other people. And that went better, but I think what was most important was that that people in the room that were triggered on Wednesday came up and thanked me for recognizing it, that they wanted to be able to talk to me about it, but they felt a little intimidated, and they also felt like it might have been weird that they got triggered. Because I said that it shouldn't be triggering. So I try to, so my lesson is again, set it up really carefully, pay really close attention to your audience so you can try to see some of the signs of trigger, and then be approachable so that people can tell you what it was that was hard for them, so that maybe you can refine your presentations. And so from now on, I'm not going to say, I'm going to define what I mean by not giving graphic details. I'm going to say what it is that I'm going to be talking about, and then remind people to take care of themselves.
And I'll add one thing. If I can add one thing on this idea of the vicarious resilience piece, because everything, it's a both and I think everything Olga says is so important, and I actually need to do better in being able to recognize and respond when, to instances of triggers. Because in my mind, one of the things, I'm really trying to normalize storytelling. And, I feel like that's super important, and especially because I also feel that a lot of times we in the United States, we conflate feeling safe with feeling comfortable. And so I find that sometimes people are triggered, and I ask people to think about what is triggering you in the moment. Sometimes it's because you've had a similar experience, and that should be handled a particular way, and you should take care of yourself. But sometimes it's because it's triggering you because it makes you uncomfortable. And particularly when those issues, that's particularly important for me when it includes things like racism and sexual assault and all that. So I ask people to, instead of removing themselves from the situation, question why it's triggering you. Because I think it's really important that we tell stories, difficult stories of things that happen in our lives, to assist one another and help each other to release the intense feelings that underlie these stories. And so that's what I mean by it's a both and. So recognizing the triggers are really important, but also recognizing what they're about and how we can release all of these feelings by normalizing these stories, I think is also just as important.
Right. Thanks, Ruby, and thanks, Olga. Jimmy, any reflections on, because I know you also shared how often you get personal disclosures after you speak as well.
Yeah, I would say two things. A lot of people, and it's kind of surprising because I'll be talking to prosecutors, police, probation officers, and there are people who come up who've never told anyone their story. And they'll want to talk. So I think we have to be mindful, if we trigger people, are we going to be able to assist people when they come up and talk to us, or do we have the resources available? I haven't had any, but I had one person who was pretty shaken up. It just brought back a lot of memories that he had tried to compartmentalize and not really deal with. The other thing I would suggest is maybe not triggering ourselves before we speak. So I've been telling my story for a long time, at least 10 years. So it's pretty easy for me, and I've been doing this work for a long time. And one day I was sitting in a different session before my session, and I decided to go ahead and take the ACEs score. I knew my score would be high, but I knew all the questions. I've seen them a million times. I've been through a million trainings on it, but I never actually did the score and looked at the number, and it kind of put me a little in my head, and I don't think I was as good as a presenter because I got stuck back in my own life for a minute. So there's also making sure I'm prepared to go up there and I'm not doing stuff to re-trigger myself to throw me off balance, I guess.
Okay. Thanks, Jimmy. Any other thoughts on triggering others before we move to our final topic? Right. So, go ahead.
I had one last thought, and this I think is specific to this audience. I'm not sure. But I was really lucky to be able to present at the Tribal Government Institute in September, and they had a room for people to go if they got triggered. And after my presentation, they asked me if I'd be willing to go and sit with the people that had been triggered, and I did. And I'd never thought to do that before, and I could just sit with them. And if they had questions, they could ask me questions. And nobody really had questions as much as they were crying. And I could just sit with them and just kind of either. And so then I started crying myself because of the, just like it was really, really powerful. And so last week there was a woman who was one of the women who got triggered at that training, and she came up to me and she goes, I don't know if you remember, but you sat with me after that presentation you did in Denver, and I really appreciated it. And it reminded me how important that was for me personally, but for other people who've had similar experiences to mine, to like, it's kind of like what Ruby said. It's just one of those things that is going to happen if you've had experiences like this. And so to just be able to kind of be with people in their pain and is really, really important as well.
Thanks, Olga, and it's so kind and generous for you to do that. And I also want to acknowledge that while you may be in a place where you feel you have the capacity to give, that not everybody will, and that's okay too. So, I mean, I think it's an important strategy, and I can understand that it may even, be beneficial for your healing as well. But I guess in shifting our conversation to talking about self-care and wellness, if you're a person who's listening to these strategies and is thinking, I don't know that I could have it in me to sit and cry with somebody after telling my story, that's okay, and that, maybe some days you will and maybe some days you won't. So this all said, I guess I'm wondering if our panelists can reflect on self-care and wellness, because really your wellness is critically important. You, in sharing your story, are sharing yourself, and so investing in your wellness is a very important part of the process of storytelling. And when it comes to managing the challenges that we've been talking about, it's really important to allow yourself the space and time to process the feelings that may come up for you throughout the process. And so for those of us, and I'm just going to put myself out there, who have a tendency to ruminate and replay events, how did things go? What did people think? How did I say this? What did they say? All of these things. There may be a risk of internalizing others' perceptions of you and your experience. Especially when you're asked those questions that feel shaming and feel judgmental. So I'm wondering if our panelists could reflect on self-care strategies. What do you recommend when it comes to the after part, after you've dealt with these challenging audiences, and, what do you do to kind of recover and repair after those experiences?
Hi, this is Rebecca.
Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you. So I think this is a great question for sharing our stories, and then also this modern world we're living in, where there are, there's things happening on social media, there's Twitter feeds, all of this stuff can go on. And I think that two things that have really worked for me. One, the value of a mentor. That person who can say, check yourself before you wreck yourself, and that mentor that can heal you in 2 minutes flat because they understand that you can be so vulnerable with them. You can put all of your stuff on the table, and they are part of your healing. Like a mentor is your most valuable asset. And then the second thing is having checks and balances with yourself. That we're imperfect beings. I ruminate too, Casey, and sometimes if something was said the wrong way or whatever that moment is that you carry in your pocket, for some reason that self-critic is pretty harsh. Just remember your checks and balances, and that it's okay to be imperfect, and it's just another educational moment to do better next time. But you must love yourself and pay attention to your healing journey.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Sure.
Well,
so I'll jump in at this point. So I tend to, when I know I'm going to go someplace and share, I usually have an idea of how hard it's going to be. for me. So then I plan what I'm doing when my day at that conference or my day at that training is done. And so sometimes, most of the time, what I do is I kind of go and I have time to myself in the room. And I usually, call my partner and talk to her about how things went, or just talk to her because it's really grounding for me. Or if there's folks that I know and I'm super comfortable with, I'll ask to get together with them. And just to be able, because sometimes when I'm left to my own devices, the ruminating can get really bad. So, but I don't want to be around too many people because I'm an introvert and it's exhausting to do all that during the day and then do that again at night. But there's some people that I just feel really super comfortable with, and they give me energy more than take energy from me. And so those are people, if they're at the conference or if they're nearby, I'm going to want to spend some time with them. And as an example, like last week, I was presenting at the conference that was really, challenging for me. And it just so happened that Ruby and our other colleague, Patricia, were like a short Uber ride away. So I would get together for dinner with them, and it would be so like I would feel so much better, and I'd forget even that I had just spent the day presenting. So that's just something that works for me. But to be really thoughtful about what is your day going to be like after you present, or the next few days after you present, and to try to do things that feed your soul, that you really love, or do things that kind of center you, that are, spending quiet time if that's what works for you. So.
Thanks, Olga. Jenny, any thoughts? Ruby, go ahead.
Yeah, no, they've done so well, so I don't want to repeat anything, but I do want to bring in, because to me, the question that Debbie asked about, to me, it really fits in here, because part of the wellness, right, is people's, what are other people saying about your story? How are they receiving it? And she was asking a question about when she's being questioned about her story, that not by audiences, but by her own family members, right, about how that, whether that happened or not. And so remember, there's other stories out in the world that help us deal with our own stories. And to me, I heard a story many, many years ago that was a school teacher who was dealing with two of her students who were constantly fighting and bickering, and they just were always arguing. And, she would try to, she sat them down finally one time and she said, what's going on? And the one girl's like, no matter what I say, she's just, she always has to argue with me. If I say something's blue, she says it's red. And the other girl, me, that's you. You're the one. Like, no matter what I say, you act like I'm lying. And she's just going back and forth. So she pulls out a ball and she sits it in front of them, and she asks the girl to her left, what color is this ball? And the girl goes, black. And she asks the girl on the other side, what color is this ball? And she says, it's white. And then so they start arguing, see what I mean? And she flips the ball around. And it is black on that side, and the other side is white. So what they are seeing is what they see from their side, from their lens, from their experience. And to me, that is a perfect story, even for our family. I recently started writing down some of my thoughts, and my brother was here, and he picks it up, because I'm writing. Oh, sorry, my video went out, but. And he reads it, and my sisters pick it up, and that's exactly how I remember it. And he's like, see, I didn't know that part, or that's not what I remember. And we're able to, and being able to engage in a conversation where I can say, what do you remember? What did you see from your side? And a lot of times it's that he had certain pieces that I didn't have. And maybe the picture is fuller when we put the pieces together, but sometimes that's just what it looked like from your side. And I think that if you're able to engage in conversations with your family about, from the perspective I had, this is what it looks. So you're not, none of you are liars. It just looks different from each side. And so the better we're able to express some of those ideas about this was my experience, this is how it looked like from the lens that I had, I think the better we'll be able to engage some of our families, and that contributes to our own wellness, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to be respectful of all those stories as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Ruby. Jimmy, any thoughts on taking care of yourself?
No, I think for me, some of it is more prep work. And what I mean by prep work, so I'm a spiritual person. And kind of similar to what Ruby was just saying, I believe people hear what they want to hear. So I always ask, because what I would do after I tell a story, you kind of think, oh, I should have said this, or I could have said that, or I could have done this. I just decide that I pray that the Spirit moves me and that people hear what they need to hear. Whether I say it right or not, right, that the message is still delivered through the Holy Spirit or whatever you want to believe in. And that kind of helps me to just let it go. So then I get up there, I might be nervous. I take my deep breath, do a little kind of Our Father kind of thing, and ask, that my message is blessed. And then I just feel that I give it out. And then when I first did my presentations, I just had such supportive staff around me. I was so close with a group of people we were doing the trainings with that I just had instant support, you know what I mean? So, and that made it really well. Now I could go into a conference where I may not know a lot of people. I just know there's a lot of good people in the world. But in the beginning, it was nice having people who I trusted and loved and cared for and knew cared for me, and it gave me strength.
And I want to follow up with one thing, because Debbie did clarify in her comments that in her particular case, I think that's good. The comments and the story are good generally. And in hers, maybe somebody's hearing a little piece or a story or a news article, and so they don't even have the whole picture to have their own narrative. So in those particular cases, although I know it's tough and I've had to get to this point, it's not like I had this right away, but it's that my role is only to tell my story. My role is not to control somebody else's perception of my story. My role is not to convince them that their story is incorrect. I go into it saying, I'm telling my story. And I don't know if that would help Debbie or anyone else who's experiencing somebody else getting their story from secondhand sources, but we only have control over how we tell our own story. And so I would just urge us to keep that in mind when we put it forward, because otherwise that trying to control what's around you can defeat you in your purpose of telling your story.
This is Rebecca. Thank you so much for that, Ruby. I'm going to say the things that we're not supposed to say, but there are hecklers. There are people that will give you a hard time. There are liars out there. There are gossipers out there. And what Ruby said, I think, is so right on. We have to make I statements, continue on our healing journey, and know that our stories are our own. There are always going to be those ones out there that are on their own journey, and that is their journey. So stay on yours in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you. And such beautiful closing thoughts as we kind of move into our last few minutes together. So thanks for all of your input on self-care and wellness. It's definitely something we prioritize in our project. Thank you for your questions throughout today's webinar. Thanks, Debbie, and others who have commented and shared stories in the chat. You really helped to make this learning experience together really rich. I want to remind everybody that, you matter, emphasizing what Rebecca just closed with. What gives your story value is you. So no matter how your story is received by it's a gift you're giving. And I want to remind you to think of it in that way. I do want to express my deep gratitude to my friends and panelists, Rebecca, Jimmy, Ruby, and Olga, for sharing such rich and valuable perspectives and stories and experiences that really help to bring to light how we deal with these challenging audiences, but move forward anyway, because it's important to move forward. I also want to thank my colleagues, Justine and Brecken, for your awesome work in supporting this webinar. And special thanks to Jane for providing today's captioning. You've been amazing. I want to encourage all of you to join us for our next webinar that's happening in January. We're titling it Not One Path, Speaking to Our Relationships with Those Who Abuse. So that also, I think, will be a very engaging and rich discussion. And if you are not currently part of our Speakers Bureau and you're interested in doing that, please be sure to reach out to us at the NRCDV, and we will follow up with you and pull you in to that initiative. So thank you to all the presenters today, all of our wonderful panelists, and to our participants for spending some time with us this afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.